The pen hit the table before he finished the sentence. That sound plastic on mahogany, sharp and final, is the thing I still hear sometimes when I'm driving home through the Montana flats and the radio cuts out. Derek Holt didn't slam it. He just let it drop, the way you drop something you've already decided is worthless. Then he looked at the room, not at me, and said the words with the tone of a man reading a medication expiration date. Effective immediately, James Calloway is relieved of his position as Chief Scientific Officer. The transition team will assume all ongoing research protocols beginning Monday. I'm James Calloway, 54 years old. I had just been fired from Medvance Corporation in front of 9 colleagues who had eaten birthday cake at my desk 3 weeks earlier. The conference room went the kind of quiet that has weight to it. My lead researcher, a brilliant woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, stopped mid-breath. Paul Merritt from Regulatory Affairs looked at his hands like he'd suddenly become very interested in his knuckles. Nobody looked at Derek, and Derek still wasn't looking at me. He was straightening his folder, sliding it into a leather portfolio with the initials DRH embossed in gold. I'd spent 26 years in pharmaceutical research. Started as a bench chemist right out of graduate school at a small biotech in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Watched 2 companies get acquired, one dissolve, and one get gutted by a private equity firm that mistook quarterly returns for a business strategy. I'd learned things along the way that you can't learn from a case study. One of them was this: when the market shifts under your feet, the only thing that holds its value is what you actually created. Derek Holt was 38. He'd come to Medvance 8 months earlier, recruited by our venture capital backers at Prescott Group. His resume listed a Kellogg MBA, a stint at McKinsey, and 2 years as a growth officer at a medical devices startup that had since been delisted. He had never synthesized a compound. He had never sat in a lab at 2 a.m. watching a binding assay fail for the 11th consecutive time. But he could build a slide deck that made impatient investors feel like they understood science. And at Medvance, that had become more valuable than the science itself. I took a slow breath through my nose. I felt the heat rising behind my jaw, that specific anger that comes from being dismissed by someone who couldn't do what you do. I let it pass, picked up the leather folio I'd brought to the meeting, slid my chair back, and stood. I nodded once at Derek. Thank you. 2 people shifted in their seats. Sarah's eyes went wide for just a second. Then she adjusted her expression back to neutral. Derek finally looked at me, and there was something almost nervous in his face. Like he'd expected me to argue, to beg, to make a scene he could reference later when explaining the decision. He had no idea what those 2 words meant. Let me back up. 12 years ago, I started building something at Medvance that the industry hadn't seen before. Our compound, I always called it CV7, though its full designation was far less poetic, was a small molecule inhibitor targeting a specific protein pathway involved in treatment-resistant non-small cell lung cancer. The kind of cancer that kills people who've already survived the first round of chemotherapy. The kind where oncologists run out of answers and start having very quiet conversations with families. The science was hard, brutally, relentlessly hard. We had 400 failed iterations before we found the binding configuration that worked. I aged visibly during those years, according to my wife, Margaret. She'd been watching me do this long enough to read the lines on my face like a research log. I remember the night in 2019 when the Phase 2 trial results came back with a 61% response rate in patients who had progressed through 2 prior lines of treatment. I sat in my car in the Medvance parking garage and called her, and couldn't say anything for about 30 seconds. She knew what the silence meant. She started crying before I said a word. The compound was valuable. Not in an abstract way, in the way that changes how a disease gets treated for the next 30 years. And I had been careful with it. 3 years earlier, when Prescott Group first started circling, and it became clear that the board was going to let them restructure whatever they wanted in exchange for the Series C, I'd had a long conversation with my attorney, a woman named Diane Foley, who had been handling pharmaceutical IP for 20 years, and had seen every variation of what happens to inventors when the money people take over. She was direct. James, she said, the patents you file through Medvance belong to Medvance, but the foundational compound methodology, the core formulation architecture, that's different. That's the thing you built before you had a budget, before the company understood what you were doing. That's defensible. We spent 4 months building the legal structure, Callaway Biosciences LLC, filed in Delaware, wholly owned by me. The core CV7 compound methodology and associated formulation patents were licensed to Medvance, not assigned. The licensing agreement was structured with a continuity clause. In the event the primary inventor was terminated without a proper transition protocol and their written consent, licensing rights would automatically revert to Callaway Biosciences pending renewal negotiation. The Medvance board signed off on it during the Series C restructuring. Their attorneys reviewed it. It was buried in the IP transfer documentation, subsection 4, 3B, under a heading called Foundational Compound Continuity Provisions. 4 pages of language that every executive had initialed, and none of them had read closely enough. That was what I meant when I said thank you. I drove home through afternoon traffic with the windows down. My phone started going off before I'd cleared the parking structure. The first text was from Sarah. James. What just happened? Are we still running the Phase 3 protocol? The file permissions are already locked. Sarah Chen was 31. She had a PhD from Johns Hopkins and a postdoc from the Broad Institute, and she was, without question, the sharpest clinical researcher I had ever worked with. I'd recruited her personally 2 years earlier, convinced her to leave a comfortable academic track because I told her what we were building mattered more. She had a husband and a 4-year-old daughter, and she had trusted me with her career. Paul Merritt from Regulatory sent a message that was just a string of question marks. My younger brother, Tom, called from Denver. Tom ran a medical consulting practice that advised hospitals on treatment protocols. He'd been following the CV7 trial data with professional and personal interest. Our mother had died from lung cancer in 2011, before the compound existed. James, he said when I picked up, is what I'm hearing accurate? I told him it was. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I told him I'd call him in a few days. My wife Margaret was waiting at home. She's the kind of person who doesn't perform calm, she actually has it. 28 years of marriage, 3 major career upheavals, 2 of our kids putting us through the particular anxiety of watching them navigate their 20s. She poured 2 glasses of wine, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and let me talk until I ran out of words. Then she said, "You've been building your exit for 3 years. I think you already know what comes next." She was right. I just hadn't expected to feel the thing I felt, which wasn't anger anymore. It was something cleaner, something almost like relief. 4 days after I left Medvance, the FDA issued their priority review decision on CV7. This was the moment the company had been building toward for a decade. Priority review meant the agency had 6 months to make a final approval determination on a compound already designated breakthrough therapy. For the kind of investors sitting in Medvance's cap table, this was the starting gun. Series D conversations, licensing deals with big pharma, acquisition talks. Derek had scheduled a celebration breakfast in the main conference room. I know this because Sarah texted me a photo of the catering setup, a full continental spread, fresh flowers, a printed banner. I know what happened next because Sarah was sending me updates from the bathroom down the hall. 8:47 a.m. Derek just tried to run the compound synthesis authorization through the regulatory portal. System rejected it. Diane Foley's name keeps appearing in the error message. 9:03 a.m. IT is in the room. Derek is asking them why the core formulation database shows external licensing status. They don't know what to tell him. 9:19 a.m. Someone from legal just walked in very fast. The breakfast is getting cold. 9:44 a.m. Derek is on the phone. He looks like a man who has just been told something he genuinely cannot process. I was sitting in my home office with coffee, watching this unfold in real time, and I felt the quiet precision of a thing working exactly as designed. The licensing reversion wasn't punitive. It wasn't sabotage. It was a legal mechanism responding to a contractual trigger, the same way a seatbelt locks when you stop suddenly. The system was simply doing what we'd built it to do. What I hadn't fully calculated was the downstream effect. The CV7 compound was already in late-stage clinical manufacturing. Medvance had 3 contract manufacturing organizations producing trial materials for ongoing Phase 3 extensions. Without valid licensing from Callaway Biosciences, those manufacturers couldn't legally continue production under the current protocols. The FDA regulatory submissions that referenced the core compound methodology were now in a contested IP status. 6 academic medical centers running active trial sites received automatic notifications from our regulatory filing system flagging the change in licensing status. Sarah's 10:15 a.m. message was short. The trial coordinators at Johns Hopkins just called. They're pausing patient enrollment pending clarification. James, this is getting serious. That one landed differently. These were patients, real people with stage IV diagnoses, who were enrolled in a trial that represented one of their last viable options. I hadn't wanted this. The legal architecture was designed to protect my work, not to interrupt treatment. I called Diane. How long until this creates real patient impact? I asked. Enrollment pauses are administrative. Patients already on protocol stay on protocol. There's a humanitarian use provision that protects that. But new enrollment, new manufacturing runs, regulatory submissions, those all stall. Diane paused. You need to decide what you want here, James, because Derek Holt is going to be calling you within the hour. She was right about the timeline. My phone rang 40 minutes later. Not Derek. His assistant first, asking if I had a few minutes. Then Derek himself, a version of Derek I hadn't heard before. The certainty was gone. He sounded like a man recalculating in public. James. I think there's been some confusion around the IP documentation. There's no confusion, I said. The licensing provisions are exactly what they say they are. Look, we moved quickly with the transition, and maybe there were some things that could have been handled differently. I think there's a path here where we solve this together. What kind of path? We're prepared to bring you back in a consulting capacity, something that reflects your contribution to the compound. We're thinking $400,000 for a 90-day engagement. Get the regulatory filings back on track. Transition knowledge to the new scientific leadership team. I let the silence stretch for a moment. $400,000 to hand over the compound I had spent 12 years building to a team Derek had assembled in 8 months. $400,000 to sign my work over to a process I had no confidence in, under management that had just demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that they did not understand what they were holding. That's not something I'm interested in, I said. James, be reasonable. The FDA timing. I told him to have his legal team review subsection 4.3a again. Then I ended the call. The call I hadn't expected came 2 days later. The name on my screen was one I recognized immediately. Dr. Victor Marsh, Chief Scientific Officer at Horizon Therapeutics in Boston. Victor and I had been on an NIH advisory panel together in 2018. He was one of the few executives in the industry who had come up through the bench science side rather than the business side, and he had the instincts that come from that path. We'd had dinner twice and stayed in occasional contact. He was, by any measure, one of the serious people in the room. His message was 3 sentences. James, I've been following the situation. If you have any interest in coffee before this gets resolved elsewhere, I'd like 30 minutes of your time. I knew what he was asking. Horizon was Medvance's most significant competitor in the oncology space. They had a strong pipeline, but nothing in the treatment-resistant NSCLC segment. CV7 sat in a lane that was effectively uncontested at the level of efficacy we demonstrated in Phase 3. I met him at a hotel lobby in downtown Chicago, neutral ground. Victor arrived without a team, which I respected. He was direct in a way that felt like genuine respect rather than a sales approach. He said, I'm not going to pretend I don't know exactly why you're sitting here. You built something that changes outcomes for patients who currently have very few options. And right now, that compound is in legal limbo because a private equity-backed COO decided that 12 years of science was replaceable. You and I both know that's not true. The question is, what happens to the compound from here? He slid a single sheet of paper across the coffee table. It was a summary term sheet. The numbers were clear. Callaway Biosciences compound portfolio. Full acquisition at $750 million. Additionally, a 5-year position as Executive Scientific Director at Horizon, with compensation, full authority over the compound's development pathway, and approval rights over the research team that would carry it forward. $750 million. For compound methodology that Derek Holt had called, in a board meeting 6 months earlier, legacy research infrastructure. I took the sheet and folded it in half, without saying a word. Victor said, We're also prepared to absorb whichever members of your former team you'd want to bring. We have the infrastructure to move fast. And James, we have the scientific leadership to actually finish what you started. I told him I needed 72 hours. Margaret and I walked 3 miles along the river that evening. It was mid-October, the kind of cold that makes everything look precise and clean. I explained the full scope of what was on the table. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always trusted about her. When I finished, she said, Is this the right place for the compound? Not for you, for the patients. I thought about it seriously. Horizon had an oncology infrastructure that was arguably stronger than Medvance's had ever been. Victor Marsh was the kind of CSO who actually read the data. Their clinical operations team had a reputation for running clean trials. The compound, in their hands, would probably get to patients faster and better than it would have under Derek's stewardship. Yes, I said. I think it's the right place. Then you know the answer. I called Diane the next morning. We spent most of the day on the phone going through the acquisition structure, tax treatment, indemnification provisions, the scope of the IP transfer, the employment agreement terms. She had been partially anticipating this moment for 3 years and had prepositioned several elements of the legal framework. Everything is clean, she told me. Calloway Biosciences owns the foundational patents without encumbrance. Medvance's licensing rights lapsed at termination per the continuity clause. There is nothing for them to contest. What about their lawyers? She paused. They've sent 2 letters already, both pointing to the same provisions that authorize the original licensing structure. Their own attorneys approved this arrangement. They're arguing against their own signatures. I called Victor that afternoon. We're going forward, but I have conditions beyond the term sheet. He said, name them. I want Sarah Chen offered a position at senior director level, with her current compensation plus 20%. I want Paul Merritt brought over to lead the regulatory affairs integration. He knows the FDA submission history better than anyone. And I want the 3 trial coordinators at Johns Hopkins, UCSF, and MD Anderson who've been managing patient relationships through this disruption. They've earned it. Victor said, already in process. I had a feeling you'd ask. I also want the patient enrollment at the trial sites restored within 10 days of closing. These are people who are sick. The administrative pause needs to end. We'll make it happen. One Thursday afternoon, 11 days after I had walked out of Medvance's conference room, my doorbell rang. Margaret answered it. She came back to the kitchen with a look I recognized, the particular expression she gets when something surprising happens and she's decided to be amused by it rather than alarmed. Derek Holt is at the front door, she said. I hadn't seen him since the conference room. He looked like a different person. The tailored jacket was replaced with a fleece. The controlled confidence of his boardroom posture was gone. What was left was a younger man who had run into the edges of his own understanding and was still in the process of mapping how far they extended. I let him in. Margaret brought coffee and then found somewhere else to be. Derek sat down at my kitchen table. He looked around the room the way people do when they're buying time, taking inventory of someone else's life. He looked at the family photos on the wall, at the stack of research journals on the counter, at the framed diagram of the CV7 binding structure that Margaret had given me 3 years ago as a birthday gift, because she'd been listening to me describe it for so long that she could explain it to people herself. He said, I think I misunderstood the situation when I came in. I didn't say anything. I thought the compound was a company asset. I thought the scientific work was something that could be managed like any other operational function. He paused. The board presented it that way. Prescott Group presented it that way. I know, I said. 12 years, James. I'm not a scientist. I couldn't see what it actually took. He looked at his hands. Prescott has already withdrawn their Series D commitment. The FDA priority review is in limbo because the compound documentation is contested. We have 3 trial site coordinators asking questions I can't answer. 2 senior researchers have already resigned. I waited. Is there any version of this where he stopped, started again? Is there any path where the compound stays at Medvance? I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, something closer to clarity. Derek, I said, 12 years ago, I had a conversation with a patient advocate who worked with late-stage lung cancer patients. She described what it looked like to run out of treatment options. She described the conversation oncologists have to have with families when the second-line therapy fails and there's nothing else. That conversation is why I kept going through 400 failed compound iterations. It's why I came in on weekends and worked through holidays and stayed at the bench long after the budget for the project had been cut twice. The compound isn't a product line. It's an answer to a question that people are dying while waiting for. He was quiet. That work deserved to be protected, I said. Not from you specifically, from anyone who didn't understand what it was. I built the legal structure because I'd watched what happened to important science when it ends up in the wrong hands. Apparently I made the right call. Derek looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the framed binding structure diagram on the wall. I watched something move behind his eyes, some recognition that had come too late to be useful. What about the employees? He finally said. The people at Medvance who didn't make any of these decisions. There are 280 people. That hit harder than anything else he could have said. The people who work there, I said. Tell your board that anyone who wants a reference from me, they'll get one. And tell HR to talk to Horizon's talent team. Anyone whose role is eliminated in the next 6 months, Horizon has agreed to fast-track applications from Medvance personnel. Derek nodded slowly. That's more than I expected. The people at Medvance aren't the problem, I said. They never were. He left without asking again about the compound. I watched his rental car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the road, and then I stood in the kitchen for a minute just listening to the house. The refrigerator hum. The October wind against the back windows. Margaret appeared in the doorway. How do you feel? Like something is finished, I said, in a good way. The acquisition closed 3 weeks later. We flew to Boston on a cold Tuesday morning. Horizon's offices were different from Medvance's in a way that mattered. There were researchers walking the hallways, white coats, over business casual, the particular body language of people who are in the middle of problems they actually care about solving. Victor met us in the lobby with a handshake that felt like two scientists greeting each other rather than a transaction completing. I signed my name 11 times. Each signature was an act of precision, not anger, not revenge, precision. The way a good experiment is precise, every variable accounted for. Every outcome traceable back to a decision made carefully and years in advance. The announcement moved through the industry press that afternoon. Horizon Therapeutics acquires core CV7 compound portfolio in $750 million transaction. Medvance Corporation stock dropped 39% before the close of trading. Prescott Group released a brief statement about evaluating strategic alternatives that everyone understood as the sound of a firm distancing itself from a mistake. Derek Holt resigned 4 days later. Sarah Chen started at Horizon the following Monday. She sent me a message that night. First day, real resources, people who ask me questions about the data and actually listen to the answers. This is what it was supposed to be. Paul Merritt joined 2 weeks after that. The FDA submitted their priority review extension acknowledgement for the reconstituted compound documentation within 30 days of the acquisition. Patient enrollment resumed at all 3 trial sites. The Johns Hopkins coordinator, a woman named Dr. Ruth Ogilvie, who had been managing the patient relationships through the entire disruption with extraordinary grace, came over to Horizon as site director for oncology trials. She sent me a handwritten note. In 20 years of clinical research, I have never seen a transition handled with more care for what actually matters, she wrote. Thank you for making sure the science survived. My brother Tom called the evening the FDA issued its final approval determination for CV7. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 8 months after the acquisition. I was sitting in my study at home when the notification came through on the regulatory monitoring system I'd never stopped watching. Tom, I said when I answered, we got it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said our mother's name, just her name, and then silence. I told him I'd been thinking about her when we designed the binding structure, that I'd thought about her often during those 12 years and all those failures and all those dark Tuesday nights in the lab when it seemed like the compound would never work, that she had been, in a way, part of why it did. People ask me now, when they hear some version of this story, whether I feel bad about what happened to Medvance, about whether it was right to use the legal structure the way I did. I don't have trouble answering that question. I built the protection because I had spent 26 years watching what happens to important scientific work when the people who built it have no structural standing to protect it. When a board optimizes for quarterly returns and the compound that could change treatment outcomes becomes a line item to be evaluated against its cost to carry. The legal structure I built wasn't designed to harm Medvance. It was designed to ensure that the compound survived whatever happened to me. As it turned out, those two things came into conflict. That wasn't my design. That was Derek Holt's. The work mattered more than any of the institutional politics around it. That's the only calculus I ever applied. What I tell younger researchers now, the ones who come to me with brilliant early-stage work and uncertain institutional backing, is this. Your science is only as protected as your legal structure. Build the protection before you need it, not after. Understand exactly what you own, what you're licensing, and what happens to each of those things under every scenario you can imagine. Because the scenario you can't imagine will eventually arrive, and you want to be standing on solid ground when it does. The compound went to market 14 months after the acquisition. In the first year, it was prescribed to over 4,000 patients with treatment-resistant NSCLC. Horizon published interim outcomes data at the annual oncology conference that winter. The response rate in real-world clinical use matched what we'd seen in the trial. Oncologists wrote about it in case reports. Patients wrote letters. I read every one of them. I'm 56 now. I work 4 days a week at Horizon and take the 5th for fishing, or thinking, or sitting on the back porch in Montana with Margaret and not working at all. We're comfortable in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was 32 and watching my first startup's funding evaporate overnight. More importantly, I wake up every morning knowing that there are people alive right now who might not be if the compound hadn't survived what happened at Medvance. Derek Holt did me a favor. He moved the compound to the place where it could do the most good. He just didn't mean to. The thank you I gave him on the way out the door was genuine. It just took him a while to understand what I was thanking him for.